The transport ship shuddered as it docked with Nexus Station, and Ensign Mira Vasquez pressed her face against the cold viewport to catch her first glimpse of the Galactic Coalition Military Academy. She had traveled for 3 months through 7 jump gates to reach this place, and now that she was here, she felt smaller than ever before. The station stretched across the void like a metal flower with 1,000 petals, each one housing training facilities and barracks and weapons ranges that serve cadets from across 200 different species. Myra grabbed her single bag and joined the line of new arrivals, shuffling toward the processing center, and she could not help but notice that she was the shortest creature in sight. A Korath warrior stood ahead of her, its body covered in natural armor plates that shimmered like polished obsidian under the station lights. And when it turned to look at her, she saw 4 eyes studying her with what the translator in her ear rendered as mild confusion. "You are the human," the Korath said. "And it was not a question." "I am," Myra replied, keeping her voice steady even though her heart was racing. The Korath made a sound that came through her translator as something between pity and amusement before it turned away and continued forward. This was going to be a long 4 years. The processing center was a massive hall filled with medical scanners and registration terminals and bored-looking officials who had clearly done this 1,000 times before. Myra waited in line for 2 hours before reaching a terminal operated by a Velanaya tall creature with blue-green skin and eyes that sat on stalks extending from its head. "Species?" the Velanai asked without looking up. "Human," Myra said. "From Earth." The Velanai's eye stalks swiveled toward her with sudden interest, and she watched as it pulled up her file on the screen. "First human cadet in 7 cycles," it muttered while scrolling through her information. "Biological classification is being updated now." Myra watched the screen as text appeared next to her name and photograph. "Category fragile, no natural armor, no venom. Glands, no regeneration capability. Single cardiovascular system internal. Skeleton composed of calcium compounds. Estimated combat survival rating without weapons or armor is 14% against baseline threats. 14%. Mira repeated quietly. "That is actually higher than we expected," the Velanai said with what might have been encouragement. "The preliminary assessment committee thought it would be closer to 6. Mira collected her room assignment and uniform specifications and walked toward the cadet barracks with that number burning in her mind. 14%. The coalition thought she had a 14% chance of surviving a fight against the most basic threat they could imagine. Her grandmother would have laughed at that number, and then she would have shown them exactly why it was wrong. The barracks assigned to her intake class housed 300 cadets in shared quarters organized by species compatibility, and Myra found herself in a small room at the end of a long corridor. Her roommate was a Dreth named Crystalex, a silicon-based life form that looked like a walking statue made of purple quartz and could apparently survive exposure to hard vacuum without any protection at all. "You are very small," Crystalex observed when Mira entered the room, its voice resonating from somewhere inside its chest. "I know," Myra said as she set her bag on the lower bunk. "You are also very soft," Crystalex continued. "I must be careful not to touch you, or I might cause damage. I would appreciate that." Mira agreed. Her first official day at the academy began with an orientation assembly in a hall large enough to hold a small spacecraft, and Mira sat in the front row because all the seats in the back were taken by cadets whose bodies did not fit in standard chairs. The commandant of the academy was a species Myra did not recognize, something that looked like a cross between a centipede and a tiger with too many limbs and teeth that seemed to go back forever into its mouth. "Welcome to the Galactic Coalition Military Academy," the commandant announced, its voice booming through speakers that made the floor vibrate. You have been selected from billions of candidates across 200 worlds because you represent the finest your species has to offer. Mira thought about the recruiting officer who had visited Earth and how desperate the coalition had seemed to find any human willing to attend over the next 4 cycles. You will learn to fight and lead and survive in conditions that would kill ordinary members of your species, the commandant continued. Many of you will fail and be sent home in disappointment. But those who succeed will earn the right to call yourselves officers of the coalition fleet. The assembly ended with combat instructor assignments, and Mira watched the screen as names appeared in pairs. Her name appeared next to Commander Dexler of the Karth Dominion, the cadets around. Her made sounds that her translator struggled to interpret, but that she understood perfectly well. They were shocked and amused, and maybe a little bit horrified. Who is Commander Dexler? She asked Crystal X, who sat beside her like a glittering purple mountain. He is the most decorated close combat instructor in the academy, Crystal X replied. He has trained 17 cadets who went on to become war heroes. And he has also hospitalized more cadets than any other instructor in the history of this institution. Wonderful, Myra said flatly. She found Commander Dexler in Training Hall 7, a circular arena with walls that could project any environment and floors that could simulate any terrain. He was larger than the Karth she had seen on the transport, nearly 8 feet tall with armor plates that had been scarred and cracked and repaired so many times that they formed a map of violence across his entire body. You are Ensign Vasquez, he said when she entered, and his 4 eyes moved across her body like he was examining something unpleasant he had found stuck to his foot. Yes, Commander, she replied with a salute she had practiced for weeks. I requested a transfer when I saw your assignment, Dexler told her, his voice flat and cold. I told the commandant that assigning me a human was an insult to my record and my skills. Mira said nothing because she had learned long ago that silence was often the safest response. I was denied. Dexler continued. The Human Integration Initiative requires at least 1 human graduate per cycle. And apparently, you are supposed to be that graduate. I intend to do my best. Commander, Mira said. Dexler made a sound like gravel being crushed, and her translator told her it was a form of bitter laughter. Your best will not matter, he said. Your species has no natural weapons. No armor, no venom, no claws, and no way to regenerate damage. So you will learn theory and tactics and hope that you never have to actually fight anything. When does melee weapons training begin? Myra asked for a moment. Dexler simply stared at her, and then he made that grinding laughter sound again. Melee weapons, he repeated. You want to learn to fight with weapons that require you to be close to your enemy when your species dies from wounds that would not even slow down a Karth child. Yes, Myra said simply. Dexler turned and walked toward the exit, pausing at the door to look back at her. Melee training begins in Cycle 3, he said. Assuming you survive that long, which you will not. The door closed behind him, and Mira stood alone in the empty training hall. She reached into her uniform and touched the ceramic blade hidden against her ribs. The blade her grandmother had given her. The blade her mother had taught her to use. The blade that had kept her alive in places far more dangerous than this station full of aliens who thought she was fragile. They would learn otherwise. They always did. The months at the academy passed slowly for Myra, each day bringing new reminders of how different she was from everyone around her. She woke before the other cadets to exercise in the empty training halls because her body required constant maintenance in a way that seemed to confuse the aliens who watched her. Why do you run in circles? A Karth cadet named Vortek asked her one morning as she completed her 5th kilometer on the track. You are not being chased by anything, My species needs to move. Myra explained between breaths. If we stop moving for too long, our bodies begin to fail. Vortek considered this information with visible horror. Your species must keep moving or you die, he said slowly. And yet you have no armor and no claws, and you cannot regenerate wounds. That is correct. Mira agreed. How did humans survive long enough to develop space travel? Vortek asked with genuine confusion. Myra finished her run and wiped sweat from her face, another biological function that seemed to disturb her fellow cadets before answering. We found other ways to stay alive, she said. Simply the xenanthropology database in the Violikitur Academy Library contained exactly 14 pages about Earth and human civilization, and Mira had read all of them during her first week. The Coalition scholars who had written those pages had visited Earth's gleaming capital, cities and clean orbital stations, and concluded that humans were a young species that had recently emerged from primitive conditions into something resembling civilization. They had not visited the Undercities. They had not seen Snow Polo Blocks 7 through 15, where Myra had grown up in tunnels carved beneath the old city, where natural light never reached and the only law was the law of survival. Her grandmother had been born in those tunnels during the resource wars, when the surface nations fought over water and farmland while millions of people retreated underground to escape the chaos. Her mother had been born there too, and she had learned the old ways from Myra's grandmother, the ways of the knife, the ways of silence, the ways of killing things larger and stronger than yourself. Myra remembered her first lesson at the age of 6, sitting in their small shelter while her grandmother placed a ceramic blade in her hands. This is not a weapon, her grandmother had said in Portuguese, her voice rough from decades of breathing recycled air. This is a promise you make to yourself that you will survive no matter what tries to stop you. What if someone bigger attacks me? Young Mira had asked. Her grandmother had smiled then, showing teeth that were chipped and worn from years of hard living. Everything is bigger than us, she had replied. That is why we learn to be faster and smarter and more willing to do what must be done. The lessons continued for years after that, every day bringing new techniques and new ways of seeing the world. Her mother taught her to map any room within seconds of entering, to identify exits and threats and potential weapons in the environment around her. Her grandmother taught her to read the bodies of other people, to see tension in their shoulders and intention in their eyes and fear in the way they held their hands. By the time Mira was 14, she had survived encounters that would have been classified as Category 5 personal combat events by Coalition standards. She did not talk about those encounters. She did not talk about the scar on her left shoulder where a man twice her size had tried to claim her family's water rations, or the scar on her hip where a gang enforcer had learned that small did not mean weak, or the thin white line across her palm where she had gripped a blade meant for her throat and turned it back on its owner. These were the lessons of Earth, not the Earth the Coalition knew, but the real Earth that existed in shadows and tunnels and places where the law was whatever you could enforce with your own 2 hands at the Academy. Mira kept these lessons hidden beneath a mask of quiet compliance. She attended classes and took notes and scored adequately on examinations while carefully never revealing what she could really do. Commander Dexler continued to treat her as a burden he had been unfairly assigned, pushing her to the back of training exercises and giving her theoretical work while the other cadets practiced actual combat. She accepted this treatment without complaint because patience was another lesson she had learned in the Undercity. Incident with the knife happened during routine equipment inspection, and the 6th month cadets were required to present all personal items for review. And Mira had known this moment would come eventually. She placed her ceramic blade on the inspection table alongside her other possessions, a few pieces of clothing, some hygiene supplies, a small photograph of her mother and grandmother that she kept in a waterproof case. A Valonai cadet named Soros was conducting inspections for their section that day, and his eye stalks immediately locked onto the blade. "What is this?" Soros demanded as he picked up the knife with obvious disdain. "A personal item," Myra replied calmly. "It appears to be a weapon," Soros said, turning the blade over in his large hands. A primitive cutting tool made of ceramic composite. Several other cadets had gathered to watch, including Vortek and a group of Korath who seemed to find the entire situation amusing. The human brought a knife. One of them said loudly enough for everyone to hear. She brought a knife to an academy with plasma cannons and particle accelerators and orbital bombardment simulators. Laughter rippled through the gathered crowd, that grinding sound the Korath made, and the whistling noise that meant amusement among the Valonai, and the crystalline chiming that was how Dreth expressed. Humorsaurus held the blade up so everyone could see it, waving it back and forth like a toy. "This is what humans consider a weapon," he announced to more laughter. "This small piece of sharpened ceramic is supposed to protect her from actual threats." Myra watched him quietly, her face showing nothing. "Perhaps she plans to cut her food with it," another Korath suggested. "Or maybe she will use it for personal grooming. Maybe she will threaten someone with it," Soros added, making exaggerated stabbing motions in the air. "Oh no, please do not poke me with your tiny human knife." The laughter grew louder, and Mira let it wash over her like water. She had heard worse in the tunnels of Snow Hollow. She had faced worse in the darkness of Block 12. When the laughter finally died down, she held out her hand toward Soros. "May I have it back, please?" she said. Her voice was quiet and polite and contained no trace of anger or embarrassment. Soros looked at her outstretched hand and then at the blade he still held, and something in his expression changed. Later he would not be able to explain what he had seen in that moment. Perhaps something in her eyes, or something in the way she stood, or something in the absolute stillness of her body that seemed wrong somehow. He returned the knife without another word, and Mira tucked it back into its hidden sheath against her ribs. The crowd dispersed, still chuckling about the foolish human and her primitive weapon. None of them understood what they had seen. None of them realized that Mira had been calculating angles the entire time, the distance to Soros, the positions of the other cadets, the location of the nearest exit, and exactly how many seconds it would take to reclaim her blade if he had refused to return it her. Grandmother had taught her that a knife was not just a weapon, it was a promise, and Mira always kept her promises. The footage leaked within 6 hours of the incident, and by the end of the day, it had spread to every major information network in the coalition. Someone in the Academy Monitoring Division had copied the recordings and uploaded them to a public server. And once something enters the galactic network, it can never truly be removed. They called it the Vasquez recording. Mira watched the view counter climb from her small quarters at the Academy. 1 million views in the first hour, then 10 million, then 100 million, then numbers so large they stopped meaning anything at all by the end of the first week. Over 900 billion sentient beings had watched a small human female dismantle 9 veteran soldiers in 43 seconds. Comments and reactions that accompanied the footage ranged from disbelief to terror to something that Mira found deeply uncomfortable: admiration. Humans are not category fragile, one popular analyst declared on a news program watched by trillions. They are category unknown, and we should have recognized this from the beginning. This changes everything we thought we knew about human military capability, a Korath defense minister stated in an official address. "We must reassess all strategic calculations involving human space." The Academy administration tried to contain the situation, by restricting Mira to her quarters and limiting her contact with other cadets. But the damage was already done. Her fellow cadets looked at her differently. Now the Korath, who had mocked her, no longer met her eyes in the corridors. The Valonai gave her more space when she walked past even Crystalex. Her silicon-based roommate, who had always been friendly, seemed uncertain how to behave around her. "I do not understand," Crystalex said one evening as Myra sat on her bunk reviewing coursework. "You were always capable of this." "Yes," Myra agreed without looking up. "But you never showed anyone." Crystalex continued. "You let them laugh at you and dismiss you and treat you as if you were nothing." Mira set down her tablet and considered how to explain something that seemed obvious to her but clearly confused everyone else. "In my home," she said carefully, "we learned that showing strength is sometimes more dangerous than hiding it." "Why would hiding strength be safer than displaying it?" Crystalex asked. "Because when people know what you can do, they prepare for it," Myra replied. "But when they think you are weak, they do not prepare for anything." Crystalex processed this information for several seconds before responding. "Your species is very frightening." The Dreth finally said Mira returned to her coursework without comment. The formal inquiries began in the second week. As military analysts from 12 different star systems submitted requests to interview her about what they were now calling the Vasquez technique, she declined most of these requests on the advice of the human diplomatic liaison who had been hastily assigned to manage her situation. A man named David Chun, who seemed perpetually exhausted and overwhelmed. "You do not understand how big this has become," Chun told her during one of their meetings. "The Galactic Security Council is convening an emergency session specifically to discuss humans in close combat. I was just defending myself." Myra said, "You incapacitated 9 veterans without killing any of them." Chun replied, "The analysts are saying that the fact you chose not to kill them is almost more frightening than if you had." "Why would that be frightening?" "Because it shows control," Chun explained. "It shows that you were never in danger, that you had complete mastery of the situation from the moment it began, and that you chose mercy when you could have chosen death." He leaned forward with an expression of genuine curiosity mixed with concern. "Where did you learn to do that?" He asked. Myra thought about her grandmother, and her mother, and the tunnels of snow, Paulo, and the generations of survival that had been compressed into her bones and muscles and reflexes. Earth. She said simply. The Vasquez techniques began appearing in unexpected places within 3 months of the recording's release. A Dreth mercenary company called the Obsidian Collective announced that they had adapted modified versions of human blade techniques for their soldiers, and their success rate in close-quarters engagements increased by 40%. 3 separate insurgencies on mining worlds in the outer reaches reported incidents involving what witnesses described as Vasquez-style combat, small fighters defeating larger opponents through speed and precision and a willingness to close distance that seemed insane until it worked. A trade dispute in the Keller colonies ended in 6 deaths when a human freighter captain was cornered by pirates who thought they had an easy target. The pirates were wrong. The Galactic Security Council emergency session convened 4 months after the original incident, and Mira received formal notification that she was required to testify before representatives of 200 species. She traveled to the council chambers on Nexus Prime, wearing her academy dress uniform and carrying nothing except a ceramic blade that she had been specifically asked to bring as evidence. The chamber was enormous, a circular room with tiered seating rising up into shadows so distant that she could not see where they ended. Representatives filled those seats in numbers beyond counting, their forms ranging from species. She recognized the creatures she had never seen before. She stood at a podium in the center of the chamber floor, a single small human surrounded by the combined political power of galactic civilization. The council president, a massive entity that looked like a floating Jellyfish made of light addressed her in a voice that resonated through the chamber. Ensign Myra Vasquez of Earth. You have been summoned to provide testimony regarding the combat techniques demonstrated during your Academy examination on Training Moon Keth 4. I understand, Myra replied, her voice steady. The Council has reviewed the recordings and consulted with military experts from across Coalition space. The President continued, and we have one primary question that we believe only you can answer. The chamber fell completely silent. Can other humans do what you did? Mira considered lying. She thought about telling them that she was unique, that her skills were the result of unusual circumstances, that most humans were exactly as harmless as they appeared. But she remembered what her grandmother had taught her about lies. They were tools to be used carefully, and this was not the right moment to use them. I am not even particularly good at it, she said, and her words echoed through a chamber that had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. On Earth, I would be considered adequate at best, she continued. My grandmother could have done what I did faster, and my mother could have done it, without them ever seeing the blade. The silence that followed seemed to have weight and substance. We have been doing this for a very long time, Myra said. We never stopped. We just got quiet about it. She looked up at the assembled representatives of 200 species, all of whom were staring at her with expressions she could not read. Humans learned to kill things bigger than ourselves because we had no other choice, she concluded, and we have been practicing for 10,000 years. The Council President did not respond immediately when it finally spoke. Its voice carried a new tone that Mira recognized from her years in the Undercity. It was the sound of fear. The survival combat examination was the most feared test at the Academy, a 72-hour trial that took place on Training Moon Keth 4 and pushed cadets beyond anything they had experienced in the comfortable halls of Nexus. Station Mira had heard stories about Keth 4 from senior cadet stories about the frozen mountains and the toxic valleys and the automated threat systems that hunted exam participants. Across the barren landscape, teams of 5 cadets were deployed to different sectors with simulated weapons and basic supplies, and they were expected to complete a series of objectives while avoiding capture by veteran soldiers who served as the examination's opposition force. The team assignments were posted 3 days before deployment, and Mira stared at the screen for a long moment when she saw her name. She had been grouped with 4 Karth cadets, Vortek, and 3 others named Krathena, Silic, and Dom, all of whom had spent the past months making her life difficult in ways both large and small. Administrative grouping. The assignment read, which Myra knew was Academy code for "We put people together who do not get along to see what happens." The transport to Keth 4 was silent and tense, with the 4 Karth sitting together at one end of the compartment while Mira sat alone at the other. The human will slow us down, Krathner said loudly enough for her to hear. We should leave her at the landing zone and complete the objectives ourselves. The rules require all team members to participate, Vortek replied, though he did not sound happy about it. We fail if she does not cross checkpoints with us. Then we carry her, Silic suggested, or drag her if necessary. Mira listened to their discussion without responding because she had learned that some battles were not worth fighting with words. The moon's surface was exactly as terrible as the stories had describe a gray and brown wasteland of rocky terrain and freezing winds that cut through her thermal suit like it was made of paper. The Korath barely seemed to notice the cold, their natural armor protecting them from conditions that had Myra shivering within minutes of landing. They moved quickly toward their first objective, a communications relay at the top of a ridge 3 kilometers from their drop point, and Myra had to jog constantly to keep pace with the longer strides of her teammates. Faster, human, Dom growled when she fell behind. We do not have time for your weakness. She pushed harder and ignored the burning in her lungs and the ache in her legs because complaining would only make things worse. They reached the relay and completed the objective, then moved toward a supply cache in a valley to the east, then climbed a frozen cliff face to reach a sensor station where they were supposed to gather intelligence 18 hours into the examination. They were ahead of schedule, and Mira was exhausted in ways she had not experienced since childhood in the Undercity. Ambush came without warning. One moment they were crossing an open stretch of rocky ground between two hills, and the next moment stun rounds were exploding against the rocks around them. Contact. Vortek roared as he dove for cover behind a boulder. Opposition force at bearing 270. The veteran soldiers emerged from concealment like ghosts, 9 of them wearing adaptive camouflage. That had made them invisible until they opened fire standard. Academy doctrine called for tactical retreat and regrouping when outnumbered, and the 4 Karth cadets followed this doctrine perfectly. Mira watched them go, their armored forms disappearing over a ridge to the north, while stun rounds struck the ground at their feet. And she made a decision that would change everything. She did not run. The veterans advanced on her position, probably expecting easy capture of the small human who had been left behind by her team. And Myra felt something old and familiar rise up inside her. It was the feeling she had known in the tunnels of Snow Paulo, the cold clarity that came when survival was the only thing that mattered. Her hand found the ceramic blade hidden in her suit, and she moved to monitoring drones that recorded Academy examinations, captured what happened next from 17 different angles. And those recordings would be studied by military analysts across 12 star systems for decades to come. The official report would describe the incident in clinical terms. Ensign Vasquez engaged 9 veteran soldiers in close quarters combat lasting 43 seconds, resulting in the incapacitation of all opposition forces with no friendly casualties. The actual footage showed something that words could not adequately describe. Myra moved through the veterans like water flowing around stones, her body bending at angles that should not have been possible for a creature with an internal skeleton. She did not fight them the way the Academy taught. She did not strike at armor plates or attempt to grapple larger opponents or use any technique that appeared in coalition combat manuals. Instead, she found the gaps. Every species in the coalition had evolved with certain weaknesses, joints that bent only in specific directions, sensory organs that required protection, nerve clusters that were vulnerable. If you knew exactly where to look, Myra knew where to look. Her blade moved in patterns that the veterans' defensive training could not predict because the patterns were not based on logic or military doctrine. They were based on 10,000 years of human violence. They were based on generations of her ancestors learning through blood and pain exactly how to kill things that were larger and stronger and better protected than themselves. The first veteran fell when her blade found the gap between his helmet and his throat armor, a space of exactly 2 centimeters that she had identified. In the fraction of a second before she moved, the second fell when she used the first as a toe shield and struck at the nerve cluster behind his primary arm. Joint the third and fourth fell together when she rolled beneath their grasping limbs and opened the hydraulic lines in their combat suits. The others tried to adapt, tried to track her, tried to use their training and experience to counter whatever she was doing. They failed 33 seconds after the engagement began. 9 veterans lay on the cold ground of Keth 4 in various states of shock and medical distress, and Mira Vasquez stood among them with her blade dripping synthetic blood from their suits. She had not used lethal force. She could have Commander Vexler arrived with the medical team 7 minutes later, his transport having been diverted when the monitoring system flagged an unusual incident. he found the veterans being loaded onto stretchers by medics who kept glancing at Myra with expressions of disbelief. And he found the small human sitting calmly on a rock, cleaning her blade with a piece of cloth from her supply kit. "Report," Dexler demanded, his voice carrying none of the dismissal it usually held when addressing her. Myra looked up at him, and he saw something in her eyes that he had never noticed before, something patient and cold and very, very old. "You said I had no natural weapons," she replied without standing. "And you were correct about that." She held up the blade, now clean and gleaming in the weak light of Cathfor's distant sun. "So my species made our own," she continued. "And then we spent 10,000 years learning how to use them on things bigger than us." She sheathed the blade and finally stood. "Would you like to see the recordings, Commander?" Dexler did not answer. He was too busy recalculating everything he thought he knew about humans. The Galactic Security Council passed Resolution 7741 Omega with a speed that had not been seen since the Void War 3 centuries earlier. The resolution was comprehensive and specific and left no room for interpretation, and derived close combat techniques were formally prohibited across 12 star systems, with immediate effect throughout all Coalition territory. Teaching the Vasquez techniques became a capital offense punishable by imprisonment on penal worlds where conditions made survival unlikely. Possession of human-designed bladed weapons now required special licensing that involved extensive background checks and ongoing monitoring. Human military personnel were banned from serving in melee combat instruction roles for a period of indefinite review, which everyone understood meant forever. The resolution also included provisions that had nothing to do with combat, restrictions on human access to certain types of military facilities, requirements for human personnel to be accompanied by handlers in sensitive areas, and mandatory psychological evaluations for any humans seeking to advance beyond junior officer ranks. The Coalition called these measures a public safety response to emerging threats. Mira knew what they really were. She graduated from the academy 3 months after the resolution passed, finishing second in her class in theoretical examinations and first in every practical assessment they allowed her to complete. Her graduation ceremony was a quiet affair attended only by a handful of officials and David Chun, who had somehow remained her diplomatic liaison through all the chaos that followed her testimony. "You could have lied," Chun said to her after the ceremony, as they stood in an empty corridor of the academy, watching ships pass through the viewport. "I could have," Myra agreed. "If you had told them you were unique, that your abilities were rare, they might not have passed the resolution," Chun continued. "Things might have been different for humans throughout Coalition space." Myra considered this for a moment before responding. "My grandmother taught me that fear based on lies is temporary," she said. "But fear based on truth lasts forever. And you wanted them to be afraid of us forever?" Chun asked. "I wanted them to respect us," Myra replied. "Fear was the only path to that respect." She received her first assignment, a border outpost called Station Kareth, in a system so far from the central worlds that messages took 3 days to arrive. It was clearly a punishment posting designed to keep her away from anything important. And Mira accepted it without complaint because she understood the game being played. She served at Station Kareth for 2 years, performing her duties with the same quiet competence she had shown at the Academy, while the galaxy slowly adjusted to its new understanding of humanity. The Vasquez recording continued to circulate despite efforts to suppress it, and each new generation of cadets at military academies across the Coalition watched it as part of their threat assessment training. Human freighter captains reported that pirates had become noticeably less aggressive in their approaches. Human Diplomats noticed that negotiations proceeded more smoothly when their counterparts had seen the footage. Human colonists on border worlds found that local species were more willing to share resources and less willing to start conflicts. The ban remained in place, but its effects were not entirely negative. Myra was standing at the observation deck of Station Karath on the day everything finally made sense to her. Watching cargo ships pass through the jump gate on their way to destinations she would probably never visit, a young Valine ensign approached her nervously, the younger sibling of Saurus. She had learned who had been assigned to the station as part of some bureaucratic coincidence that probably was not coincidental at all. Lieutenant Vasquez, the ensign said, using the rank she had earned through 2 years of exemplary service. May I ask you something? Of course, Myra replied without turning from the viewport. The ban, the ensign said. The restrictions, the fear, all of it. Does it bother you that they are afraid of humans now? Mira watched the freighter accelerate toward the jump gate, its engines leaving trails of light across the darkness of space. What is your name? Ensign, she asked Tarl. The Valanai replied. Tarl, Myra said, finally turning to face the young officer. Let me ask you something first. Do you know why your sibling returned my knife that day at the academy? Tarl's eye stalks wavered with uncertainty. He never told me, Tarl admitted. He said he did not understand it himself. He returned it because for one moment he saw something that his training could not explain. Myra said, something that told him returning the knife was safer than keeping it. She paused to let this sink in before continuing. Every species in this coalition has something that makes them dangerous, she said. The Karath have their armor. The Valanai have your regeneration. The Dreth can survive conditions that would kill anything else. She touched the blade at her side, the same blade her grandmother had given her, now legally grandfathered into the regulations because no one had been willing to challenge her on it. Humans had none of that. She continued. We were small and soft and breakable, born on a world that was trying to kill us with predators and diseases and natural disasters that wiped out entire populations. Toro listened with the intensity of someone hearing a truth they had suspected but never confirmed. So we learned to be the thing that kills the thing that should have killed us. Mira said, we got so good at it that it became instinct, written into our blood and bones and the way we see the world. She drew the blade slowly, letting Toro see how naturally it fit in her hand, how it seemed to be an extension of her arm rather than a separate object. They are right to be afraid, she admitted. But here's what they do not understand. We do not want to hurt anyone. We never did. We just want to survive. She sheathed the blade in a single smooth motion. And we will do anything to make sure we do, she finished. We will learn anything, become anything, sacrifice anything, because survival is the only thing that matters when you start with nothing. Toril nodded slowly, and Mira saw understanding dawn in the young Valanai's eyes. Thank you, Lieutenant, Tarl said quietly. You are welcome, Ensign. Tarl departed, and Myra returned her attention to the viewport and the endless darkness beyond. Somewhere out there, in academies and training halls and quiet places across the galaxy, instructors were adding new modules to their curriculum modules about humans, about the dangers of underestimation, about the terrible things that soft and breakable creatures could become when they had no other choice. The ban would hold, the fear would spread. Humans would continue doing what they had always done, surviving against odds that should have been impossible, adapting to challenges that should have destroyed them, becoming whatever they needed to become to see another sunrise. Myra touched the blade at her side one final time and allowed herself a small smile. Her grandmother would have been proud the galaxy had finally learned the truth about humanity, not the truth in the diplomatic files or the xenanthropology databases, but the real truth the truth that had been written in blood and pain, and 10,000 years of refusing to die, the truth that made humans the most dangerous species in the coalition, not because they were strong, but because they had never been strong, and they had survived anyway. That was the promise her grandmother had made her understand so long ago in the tunnels beneath Snow Hollow, the promise that every human carried, whether they knew it or not. We are small, we are soft, we are breakable, and we will never, ever stop fighting to stay alive. That was the inheritance of Earth. That was the legacy of humanity. And now the entire galaxy knew it.